Before we get into today's show, Andy, you and JJ were at the Parc des Princes last night to watch PSG against Monaco in the Champions League, and you got to watch a good game.
Yeah, I think the tail wagged a little bit more than anyone was expecting. And, you know, the champions aren't quite looking at their absolute best. And Monaco made a real match and a real tie of it. So we discussed that. We discussed whether PSG can do a PSG repeat. And then we discuss a little bit about Monaco and where they're at after this as well.
Well, you can hear all of that, Andy and JJ's reaction to that game in detail. You can find the episode below this one in your podcast app or on YouTube. However, we should start this edition of OTC with talking about the state of Italian football currently in the Champions League. Well, Atalanta had to save their blushes, and that's not an understatement, Andy. What on earth has happened to Italian football since Inter were in the finals last year?
Well, it's an interesting question because after Tuesday night when Bodø Glimt knocked out, who are not the Norwegian champions, as we know, knocked out Inter.
Not even the Norwegian champions.
I left the even bit out, but yeah, you can say that. There's been a lot of hand-wringing in and outside Italy about the state of Serie A. And with Atalanta managing this extraordinary comeback, with Juventus almost managing an extraordinary comeback with 10 men, of course, for half a game and for extra time in the end, as it turned out, it felt like Serie A sort of, I guess, saying, hang on, we're not dead yet. But it took Atalanta to lead the way in this early game. And funnily enough, David, despite the relatively small deficit that they had to make up compared to, say, Juventus, it felt as if they had the steepest mountain to climb, and they did it.
I think so. I think in terms of quality of opponent, then yes. And look, we'll get into Dortmund's mentality in these big games very soon. But yes, this was a difficult ask. But I think the way that they approached it, the way that they took the game to Dortmund, eternally optimistic about turning the tie over, was really impressive. And it continued a brilliant level of work that Palladino has done since coming in, since he replaced Ivan Juric.
I wanted to ask you about him, actually, because I know like you think quite deeply about coaches and what they're doing. Firstly, as our producer said earlier, let's just remember everyone that Ivan Juric was in charge at the start of the season. Wow.
Incredible. Yeah.
You know, of course, it made sense from a local perspective in that he was a sort of disciple of Gianpiero Gasperini, and that was the idea, but it didn't work out because they got current Ivan Juric. Palladino's had an interesting couple of years because of how it ended at Monza, then how it ended at Fiorentina with various fallouts. But he's a really interesting coach, isn't he?
I think he's an interesting coach, and he's also a very, very good coach as well. Tremendously exciting coach. And I think this is the perfect job for him. I wanted Atalanta to replace Gasperini with him directly. They didn't do it. I also thought he might have ended up with Juve as well, but he didn't end up going there either. So he stayed on the market, and I think Atalanta were very, very lucky. And this is Atalanta, who have been such a great, just really well run for a number of years. And we've discussed on this podcast throughout just how brilliantly run they are. And for them to make I think, a poor decision in Juric, I think a lot of people looked at their appointment and said, this doesn't really add up for what Atalanta are.
But do you think it's a little bit like Man United losing Sir Alex Ferguson? You need your David Moyes. You need your buffer in between. Because you were saying if Palladino had taken over directly, it's a different job, isn't it, really?
It is, absolutely. I just thought Juric was just a very, very strange way to go.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand that. But either way, we're here and Palladino's here. He's been brilliant since he came in. I think it's 10 wins. I think it's only 2 defeats since he's come in. So he's clearly changed a lot there. And it's great to see. And then I've already seen the comments from Juve fans saying like, "Oh, we perhaps missed a beat, not getting him in." And look, the levels that Gasperini found at Atalanta, and we all know about the incredible recruitment throughout the years as well, were extremely high. And to maintain that is nigh on impossible. So Palladino has a different job, I think, at Atalanta now. And this game showed that they can still provide at the very top level.
Although you were somewhat reticent about the performance of Dortmund, are you?
It was just Dortmund. Look, we use a term in the Premier League, Spursy, and I think Dortmundy exists as well. I think it does. There's a lot of evidence there, whether it be domestically. We all know about them losing the Bundesliga title when it was in their hands on the last day, and we know about their record in Europe as well when it's come to finals, when it's come to big games as well. This continues that. I don't think there's any getting away from it. And the players have been different. The coaches have been different, but the mentality seems to still be there, where they doubt themselves, where they question themselves at very, very key, precise moments.
It's funny because there are stages of this game, aren't there? Because I think if you cut the first half off, and if we just examine the first half, as David says, Atalanta are very well armed by Palladino coming into this. Atalanta are brilliant in the first half. And actually, of all the little switches he's made, putting Zawewski, who is basically a wing back at Roma and Inter as well, into this sort of almost like one of two number 10s sort of position. He gets loads of the ball. He makes great runs. He has a couple of really good efforts on goal as well, and gets himself into dangerous positions. And if it isn't for Gregor Kobel, who, funnily enough, ends up making the mistake that basically cost Dortmund the game right at the end. I mean, they would have been dead by half-time without Kobel. And Kobel is someone who, if you look at their run to the final in 2024, without him, they don't get anywhere near that final as well. But funnily enough, sometimes, and I've said this, I'm sure, numerous times on OTC, one of the funniest things is how football sort of subverts the law of first impressions last impressions last. And I think a lot of us come away from that game and think, Dortmund had a load of chances in that second half. It was really Dortmund lost that game rather than Atalanta won it. I wonder if that's slightly the wrong way round of looking at it, because if Kobel hadn't performed to such a good standard in that first half, Atalanta were blowing them away before the break. And yes, it did change round. Yes, Dortmund did get a foothold in the game. And yes, before the 3-0 and after the 3-0, they had the chances. You think of Girassi having a good chance, Fabio Silva having a good chance. In the end, it took a great goal from Karim Adeyemi, who came on and made a good contribution to get them back into the game. And then, I guess, comes the Dortmundy bit that you're talking about.
It's not just the fact that you are beaten, but it's also the manner.
Yes.
Sometimes you're like,
it was quite interesting. I thought Emre Can came out and talked about it afterwards. And he said, well, firstly, we can't blame Gregor because he's pulled us out of the shtuck so many times, which is what you would expect the captain to say about his goalkeeper. And Kobel is an outstanding goalkeeper, which makes the mistake harder to understand because it's not like he's dropping a shot or dropping a cross or like letting a shot slip through his fingers. It's just a bit of casualness that you wonder, why would you do that at that point in the game, I suppose. But it was interesting. What else Emre Can said is he said that ultimately we were a little bit unlucky, and you can discuss the penalty. I think it's discussable, and I think really the fact that Kristovic has got blood all over him makes the referee's mind up rather than the actual challenge itself. Okay, we could discuss that forever and ever. But I thought what was interesting is Can goes, yeah, well, we just made too many mistakes to win that game. It's like, well, you did. But it kind of happens a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's my problem. There's a bit of an acceptance there.
Yes, that's
exactly
exactly
what I'm
it.
talking about, identity and mentality.
That is exactly it. And I think, for me, Dortmund going out of the Champions League just before the last 16, okay, it's a little bit disappointing. Okay, they're not going to win the league. But to me, it doesn't feel like a massive, great big deal because Kovac is a transitional coach for a transitional squad. They're gradually hauling themselves out of all these years of terrible recruitment, of which Emre Can, even though he's had his good bits for the club, is because, they saddled themselves to 2 big contracts for him, for a player who, is not going to elevate them above the level that they are already. And I think once you get to the other side of where they are at the moment, when Can goes in the summer, when Zula goes in the summer, maybe Gregor Kobel goes off and finds himself a club where he might actually win something. And I think if a few of the old guard go, and Marcel Sabitzer will be next, really, Kovac is trying to steer them into a place where the squad makes more sense. Mm-hmm. I reckon Girassi, I reckon he'll probably go as well. Mm-hmm. I reckon they're getting younger, they're getting more athletic, they're getting towards not just a team that makes more sense for Kovac, that makes more sense for Dortmund and what they are and where they should be. Whereas what happened is, after the Klopp years, them adapting to being big boys, they've never quite got there, have they? I think in terms of working out what it means to be a big team, not just a big club, but a big team with a big wage bill that competes with stuff. They're not the youth club that won stuff under Klopp. They're not that anymore. Mm. And I think in too many people's minds, they are that. And in fact, they've gone too far the other way, because some of these experienced players, and they started it by getting rid of Pascal Gross, for example. Yeah. They need to get to the other side of that, and they're not quite on the other side of it yet.
So that kind of leads me to my next question. You've mentioned recruitment there. Do you have confidence that the recruitment levels are there for them moving forward?
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think Joe Bellingham, as we've said before, I think is maybe the centrepiece of that, because they've spent a lot of money on him. We don't know yet if he's going to become the player that they really need in the centre of the park. He's a good player, but is he a Champions League level player? Is he a Champions League level starter for a club like that wants to do well in the Champions League and wants to compete in the Bundesliga? And him and Mecha and the players around him, they will answer that question, I think, over the next year or so. But as I said right at the beginning, Dortmund and Bellingham massively need that transfer to work. Yeah. Because he needs to prove he can go to the next level, but they need to prove that they're still a developer of elite talent if they want to go back to being that, which they should.
I mean, he's signed there, and obviously his career is obviously guided very strongly by his father, as his brother Jude has. They've clearly, they're not idiots. They know what sort of path that they want, the Bellinghams for their boys. There was obviously the famous story about Jude going to Man United. They looked out there and go, this isn't the right one for us. Could have been very easy for him to sign for Man United and go there, but he didn't. Job's clearly looked at Dortmund after Sunderland as the next, step up. So they've clearly looked at it and said, "Oh, Dortmund are still that club." He's not going there just for a random next big move. They've looked at that move and gone, "Okay, this is the right one." Dortmund are this particular club.
For Job?
Yeah, for Job, yeah.
Do you think they do think that? Or do you think, oh, this is familiar, this is nice, we had a good time here the first time. It could work for us again.
There is? Yeah,
because you could argue the logical move was Eintracht Frankfurt.
Yeah.
Because that's the place that develops players. And he could have gone there.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're Joe Bellingham, or for that matter, if you're James McAtee and you're struggling to get into the Nottingham Forest team, are you sitting there now thinking, there must be a little part of you thinking, yeah, maybe I'd be a bigger player if I'd have gone there. Yeah. Or maybe I'd be further ahead if I'd have gone there.
Let's not forget that Bellingham Senior wasn't very happy initially when Job went across there. He thought that they weren't, treating him as he would have wanted them to treat him. That aside, you know what we've gone and done here? We've gone and taken victory out of the jaws of Atalanta and talked all about Dortmund. But it does beg a question.
He basically just blue-tacked a poster of Rafael Palladino to the wall at the start of this. And you're saying it's been stolen away from Atalanta. No.
No, okay.
I'll tell you what, though. They are a match for anyone at home.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask, because if there were question marks about Dortmund, then does that not impose Dortmund against Atalanta? Does that not impose a question mark about Atalanta as they go forward in the last 16 now?
Yeah, but for Atalanta, I think last 16 is slightly above par. I mean, this is what they didn't manage to do last year. They got knocked out by Club Brugge at this stage last year.
Indeed.
So they didn't get murked. They did the murking this year, which I think you can be quite happy with. It was their turn. And I'm going to go back to what Nicky Bandini and I have said in recent weeks, that if you didn't know about the history, the way they came out the traps yesterday, if you didn't know about the history of Gianluca Scamacca, you'd be thinking, go and buy him Premier League club. And really, that's what you're meant to do if you're... Palladino has had a massive effect on Scamacca. He has made him really important. And I think when you look at them, not just improving as a team, as David has said, but improving individual players. So we talked about Zawewski, we talked about Samazic, and, we talked about, as well, Dortmund developing from what they were. Atalanta aren't small time anymore. Okay, they're not the biggest club in the Champions League, but they go out there and spend proper money on players. Yeah. It's not Gasparini and his merry men anymore. It's not that. It's something bigger.
A couple of clubs might underestimate them as well and say, "Oh, well, Gasparini isn't there anymore. Luckman isn't there anymore." That Atalanta was really, really good, and they were the flavour of the last few years, but they're not there anymore. And all it takes is a club to think that and underestimate them and get done by them. So it's Arsenal or Bayern next for Atalanta.
Yeah.
I mean.
There's the look of a convinced man.
No.
I really would love to see Palladino versus Arteta. I think that's a really, really intriguing matchup in terms of the way that they both coach. Both young managers as well, and they're different philosophies, different outlooks in the football. But I think that would be a really good contest between those two.
That would be really interesting. Yeah. Not quite as exciting as Galatasaray at Tottenham. Which is of course another possibility.
Yeah. Of course.
Andy always has to bring it back to Turkey, but
yeah, I do.
Yeah. Turkey, if you don't.
Turkey. Sorry.
Arguably, the biggest shock of this round of the Champions League involved an Italian club, the one that was in the final last year, Inter. And they played Bodø Glimt, who had beaten them in the first round, which was in Norway. And people think, oh, well, that's in Norway. It's above the Arctic Circle. So Bodø Glimt are going to win that one. And it's on a plastic pitch, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the really impressive thing is that they went to Inter and they took it to them. Although Inter dominated the game, at least that's what it looked like to me. But Bodø Glimt were playing their game, weren't they, David?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Inter dominated at all. I thought Bordeaux approached it in a way that they were always in a position to score and to have their moments, and they did that as well.
Agreed.
This is not a team, a plucky. Let's be absolutely clear here, because we know the story about them. Population of 50,000, near the Arctic Circle, tiny stadium, all this. They do not play like a team with that background and that size. They don't play like a plucky underdog. They impose their personality and style on games, whoever they are playing, whether it be last year's finalists or whoever it may be. And that is what's so admirable about them. And that's the best thing, I think, about this Bodø Glimt story, is the manner in which they play these big teams. It is not sit in and break on the counter. No. They will look to control big aspects of those games, and they did against Inter. And incredibly high levels of technical ability as well. They all work for each other. Absolutely, they do. And they're very organised. But my word, they have got masses of quality in that team as well.
And they do kind of play like a big team swatting off an underdog, don't they? Actually, that they did that in these two games. I mean, it's interesting like how you framed it, Dotun, because you're right in terms of possession, in terms of shots. Inter have more in both of these games. But I guess it shows you how statistics can be slightly misleading sometimes, because it never felt as if Inter had a level of control in either of those games, I don't think. And particularly in this second one, it's slightly different, obviously, because of the way it's set up, the fact that Inter are chasing a 2-goal deficit, which nevertheless, given their resources and their recent history in the competition, they should be able to at least have a stab at doing. But even in the bits where they're having shots, and they're having shots on target, it doesn't really feel...
Dozens of shots on target, they get just one.
It doesn't feel as... But again, I think you have to ask yourself about the quality of the shot.
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like Bodø Glimt are in trouble really at any time. And they just wait for their point and pick them off with like really like excellent goals of their own as well. Obviously, you have the Manuel Akanji error, but the way they take advantage of that, Bodø, is incredible. And there is a sense of been there, done it. I guess the point is, if we look at, say, the Europa League as a way to learn to play in the Champions League, which ever since we go back to the last reformatting of the Europa League, which was around about 2008, something like that. I'm sure someone can correct me if I'm a year or two out. But the idea was it would be like a shadow Champions League. And that's why you had the movement in between the Europa League and the Champions League, with the team that's third in the group in the Champions League going down to the Europa League, even though that wasn't to the taste of many. But I think it's quite interesting. Everything that Bodø did wrong, we said this before, everything that Bodø did wrong in the Europa League last year, they're fixed for the Champions League this year. Every situation that they've been in. So, honestly, they were completely outclassed, outthought. They were technically inferior in both of those games against Tottenham in the Europa League semi-final last year. And that's the remarkable thing to me, that they've come this far. Obviously, this is the most remarkable run of results for a Norwegian team in
Rosenborg?
Well, ever, really.
Well,
I think if you look at these four wins in a row.
But Rosenborg got to the quarterfinals.
In 97. And it's interesting hearing people talking about it in Norway, like TV pundits, like Ståle Solbakken, the national team coach. They're like, well, this is already bigger than Rosenborg, because they understand how the game has changed, how less accessible the elite of European football is for a Norwegian team, even a Norwegian team and a Norwegian club that's like built a power base and built a plan and built a development system over the last 5 or 6 years. So, I mean, you look at the opposition they've beaten, and as you were saying at the start, okay, a couple of those you expect them to have a bit of advantage at home, but there was, in one of the reports I was reading in Norway, there was very much on the grass, almost in capital letters, for the games at Atletico and the game at Inter this week,
where they should arguably have been at a disadvantage, shouldn't they?
Yeah,
they should.
I don't know. It's like Nadal off the clay, isn't it? But I suppose the interesting thing is that they looked like so far from being up to a big occasion against what I think we have to say big-ish team in Tottenham at this point last year. No, at this point, not even at this point last year. We're talking about May last year, so we're talking about 9 months ago. How have they fixed that all in such a short time?
It's remarkable, and I think you've got to remember as well, they're in their off-season now. So
did that not play to their advantage? Though?
Yeah, Nicky suggested that's an advantage, which I think is an interesting point.
That's an interesting one.
When you bear in mind that like everyone else is, well, Inter are probably about 2.5 months off being properly knackered, aren't they?
Yeah.
And maybe they're slightly younger this season, so that won't have the same effect. Well, basically, they haven't got the same fixture list, so now it's a moot point, isn't it? But
it's interesting because, I mean, and then I guess the other side of that is you could say, well, you'd expect these teams to be fitter. They're in their seasons. They haven't really reached the business end of their seasons yet. Shouldn't they be at peak fitness now, a lot of the European sides?
I guess this is where we mustn't forget the Club World Cup.
Yeah,
because I think
I try to, Andy.
Right. But I think we've seen elements where Inter, Juventus, PSG actually this week could have looked fresher. You would have expected them to look fresher. And I'm not just talking about physical freshness, but like mental freshness. I felt with PSG, when me and JJ were there last night, there should have been the bit like when they got themselves in front at 2-1 and that kind of gifted the lead really. That you think, okay, this is the bit where you have 10 good minutes and you move to kill the game. And you're waiting for them to kick into that next gear. And it never happens. And I think a lot of that you could say about their fellow finalists. A lot of that you could say about Inter, I think.
Yeah, it's fair. And look, and again, this is a remarkable achievement. It really, really is. We've got to remember where Inter are as well in their development, I guess, don't we? This is a big season for them in that they've moved on from the Inter that we've seen the past few years. 2 out of 3 Champions League semi-finals, I think it was. Inzaghi, so synonymous with a certain style, and you could name that team, and Dumfries, DeMarco, Martinez, you could name that cluster of players. They're trying to move on as well. So this is a season of transition for them. And again, I'm not making excuses whatsoever.
Are they trying to evolve what should basically be a rebuild, do you think?
I think so. I think that's what they're trying to do. I think they want to retain aspects of what Inzaghi had, but they're also wanting to find something they perhaps saw that Inzaghi Inter did not have. That sometimes they were a little bit square, and they're wanting to try and find that different type of player and different type of key to kind of unlock teams. So it's an interesting period for them, and their development will continue, and they've got a Serie title still to win, which they're very much in the running for.
I'm so glad that we've bigged up Bodø Glimt. So, I won't need to come back on this and say, we haven't talked about Bodø Glimt, they're the ones. But we must talk about Inter a little bit more now. Yeah. It will come as a shock to a lot of people that this is the same Inter that were in the finals last year, because they're way off the pace throughout.
It's the same but different, and that's why I had to bring that up. This is a very different Inter and what have you like that. And we're talking about. Andy said it's amazing how much Bodø have changed from last season's competition, and Inter have changed a lot from last season's competition as well.
But nevertheless, you would have expected Inter to see this out, wouldn't you? Or am I the only person who thinks, well, this is a huge upset now?
Oh, it is. Totally. But I think it's also, I don't think that's necessarily contradictory to what David's saying. Because if you look at, you could say very little's changed in terms of personnel. But again, you could say that about PSG. But where are the levels that you're expecting of those players? Now, maybe, maybe they're trained to peak a little bit later. And maybe that's where you find the shock, because, you would think an Inter or PSG for that matter is primed to peak in the quarterfinals or the semi-finals, like late March, early April. Maybe that's the plan, and maybe that's what's coming. With Inter, obviously, we're never going to find out. But if I look at that Inter team, I think who are the players who, at least in a European context, are playing to the. It could be any of them actually. It could be domestically as well. Who are the players who are playing to the level that they were this time last year? I'm thinking DeMarco. I don't really know who else.
Yeah, I'm not too sure who else as well. And
it would have been Lautaro, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean that makes a massive difference.
Of course he does. Do we give them a hospital pass because of that?
No, I don't think we can, but I think it's a welcome recognition that you've made there of the fact that he's one of the best strikers in the world.
But he's a key player as well, isn't he?
Yeah, he's talismanic as well. And of course, you look at his goals record in the Champions League last season. All of those things, just to describe him in the numbers is wrong. But you kind of have to describe it in the numbers because that made a massive difference last season.
What would have happened if, I've got to ask this, if Atalanta hadn't won their game against Dortmund and all the Italian clubs had gone out of the Champions League at this stage, what would the conversation have been from an Italian perspective now?
We'd be doing a On the Continent special on the demise of Italian football today, probably. No, honestly, to answer your question, that's where it would have been. We would have been doing a post-mortem on it.
But what about in Italy? From Italy, what would they be? How shocked would they be?
Well, there's a lot of hand-wringing anyway.
Yeah, I think there still is anyway. Yeah. I don't think that Atalanta result has glossed over the fact that Juve and Inter, so synonymous with dominating Italian football, and Napoli as well, obviously, recently, going out in the way that they have. So there is very much a microscope on it now, and lots of former coaches, former players are already putting a spotlight on Andy. So
yeah, and well, you brought to my attention some really interesting stuff that Alessandro Del Piero had to say about it. But it's interesting because I think when you look at Italy, you always think of like strong youth production. And funnily enough, Atalanta, the team who have been successful this week, they're synonymous with having a really great academy. going back 20 years or so. Not so much at the moment. There's a lot of like furious trading, and I guess that's the same like amongst the clubs, isn't it? You think player trading is much bigger than player development. Part of that is resource in the last 20 years since Calciopoli as well. I think this has been a long time coming, but of course, like part of the reaction actually in Italy is due with the fact that the Norwegians have come to Milan and done it to them again, basically, just as they did in the World Cup qualifiers. And there are a lot of people feeling very apprehensive, and I noticed this when I was speaking to people over there in December when I went to see Atalanta and Inter at home. There are a lot of people who are very, very apprehensive about the upcoming World Cup playoffs, whereas you would expect a sense of, come on fellas, let's get this done. But there's not that, actually.
Let's put a sock in it, because we've got a great question on tomorrow's Ask OTC about Italian football. So hold your fire until then. Let's instead focus on the Bundesliga now, with the time that we've got left. I suppose what there is to play for is top four now, and the challenge is to try and get into the Champions League for next season. Stuttgart are amongst those in the race, Leverkusen as well, both of them in action in Europe this week. And I wonder whether we can now look at them and say that their minds are on next season rather than this season, because, from what we've said about Dortmund, for example, and everybody but Bayern in Germany, they'll be fighting for the top four, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of both. I think they do still have their eyes on what is possible in Europe this season as well. I mean, Leverkusen getting through to the last 16 of the Champions League by getting past Olympiacos, which really it was all about the first leg and what they got done in the first leg. Stuttgart, you have to presume, and maybe you're listening to this on the way home from the match on Thursday night, and I'm wrong, and Celtic have pulled out a hell of a shock to top that of Atalanta. But I think we have to assume at this point, at the time of recording, that it should be a formality for Stuttgart to go through against Celtic. I think there are dual things going on here, because we'll get to the race for this season's top four and next season's Champions League in a minute. But in terms of what they're doing in this season's European competition, I think it's slightly different. For Leverkusen, it felt like getting to the last 16 was their bare minimum requirement, really, for this season to carry on the progress of recent seasons. Just as getting to the top four is a bare minimum requirement for them in what has been a really weird, very, very transitional season. With Stuttgart, I think it's slightly different, because I don't know about you, David, but not only are they in fourth position and 4 points ahead of Leverkusen at the moment in this race for the top four, they're a genuine contender for this Europa League, for my money.
I'd put them there with the favourites. They might even be favourites. The manner with which they're top scorers in the competition, the manner with which they've approached it has been really impressive. And I used to always say this about Spanish teams back in the day when Barcelona and Real Madrid were dominating. If you're a team in that cluster of maybe 3rd to 7th and you're in Europe, you should be going all out to win that European competition that you're in. So I used to say about the Sevillas, the Villarreals and players like this. So, and I'm flipping this now to those Bundesliga teams as well. So Stuttgart should be going all out. Look, Bayern's 95% certain going to win that league. Okay, you look at that. Right, we'll finish as strong as we can. But you should be putting all efforts to win that European competition. At the end of the day, football is about trophies, and you want to give trophies to your fans. And that's why I think they have to go for it all out.
It makes sense. You would have thought, though, that of the top four in Germany now, once you take Bayern Munich out of the equation, that the other three, or the other 4 or 5, it would be, would it, compete for those rest of those 3 places, are in a kind of a league of their own, almost.
Yeah, I mean, Hoffenheim, I guess, are the one that's put the cat amongst the pigeons. No one expected them to be in third. Dortmund in second are really where they should be, if you look at budgets and natural gravity and all that sort of stuff. So really, if we say that Hoffenheim, for argument's sake, are going to keep up the pace. That really leaves one place for Stuttgart, Leipzig, and Leverkusen. And that is one heck of a bum
really
fight.
Interesting race.
Really, because it has become clear in recent weeks that Leverkusen cannot afford, in terms of prestige, in terms of their plan, in terms of money, to miss out on that Champions League spot. Leipzig, okay, they sold a few big players last summer, but they reinvested a lot of that. Yeah. They've got a team that really is focused on getting in the Champions League. That's the reason that the squad has been assembled as it is. And maybe if they get in the Champions League, it will stop them it will take them out of the position where they have to sell Dotun and Andy. You know, they might still, but it could take them out of the position where they have to, which is important. And Stuttgart, I think, are in the most interesting position out of any of these teams, really, because I think take away Bayern and maybe Dortmund, this is the team that I think is maybe the best team in the Bundesliga. They're certainly the best to watch.
Yeah,
they've certainly got the best coach in Sebastian Hoeneß, and if Kompany hadn't done such a good job at Bayern, I think Hoeneß would be there already, and not just because of his family connections.
19 in 9 games, as you mentioned, David.
Yeah. But I think the interesting thing about them and where they've come from, as we've said before, bear in mind that he took them over when they were a kind of yo-yo team, and they were looking at relegation, steers them away from relegation in the playoffs, very next season gets them into second. Season after that, they do all right in the Champions League. They certainly play well, even if they don't get to the next stage, and they win the cup. And now they're back in a position where they could win the Europa League, or at least challenge for it, and get themselves into the top 4. And season after season, he has done that despite the fact that they have lost a couple of big players every one of those seasons, not especially replaceable players. And he's done it, the manner in which he's done it. You can talk about the goals. They do it by dominating possession and dominating games, which is amazing. And if I was any board of a top European team looking for a coach who I can really believe in, I would want him.
Yeah. We talked about Dortmund and mentality and identity and switching that around and getting away from that mental block. We've seen what Hoeneß has done at Stuttgart, and he's changed the mentality that club had of being a yo-yo club and just being meandering. He's making, and like you said, they found consistency to stay at the top.
You know, when you were talking about Dortmund and their, I guess, inability to really find that extra bit of personality, if, for argument's sake, and I'm not saying this would happen, if you took Sebastian Hoeneß and put him in charge of Dortmund, would that fix their problems? Or do you think the club's not real well run enough for it to work?
I don't think they're well run enough. They're certainly not as well run as Stuttgart are.
No.
At one point, Dortmund were the model. Everyone used to talk about Dortmund being the model for European football. They were heralded. They're not anymore. We've seen them. They've got some very decent coaches over the past few years, and they haven't been able to fix it all on their own because other little intangibles behind the scenes are not right, namely recruitment.
They did make black and yellow the, go-to colours for a kit.
I thought that was Wiz Khalifa.
Very good. You're on it today. Okay, it's that time when we reflect on the Game of the Week selections from last week. We always recommend games of the week for listeners to watch over the course of the weekend. And, well, Andy, last week you picked Leipzig versus Borussia Dortmund. You couldn't have planned it any better.
It was good, even though we were hoping that it would be maintained at a 6-point gap between Bayern and Dortmund ahead of the Klassiker. It was a funny thing because Dortmund didn't come out of the game with exactly what they wanted, that 3 points that would have kept it at 6. But they felt as if they'd left with something because they were outplayed for a lot of it. They were 2-0 down, and then they got themselves back and got the draw. And good coaching from Niko Kovac. He used the bench really, really well as well. Leipzig would be absolutely kicking themselves. But he kind of came out of that thinking, that was a good effort on the road. They've got this Atalanta thing completely in hand, haven't they?
Was it a good watch, though?
It was a great watch.
Yeah. And Nicky picked Juventus versus Como, David. And Well, Como did the job on him.
They did indeed, and Como very exciting this season. One of the must watches, and just trying to fly that flag for Serie A. It is still exciting. There's teams that are very watchable.
It's a shame because if that had been played at Como, my daughter would have been there.
Oh, really?
She was there, for a few days. She would have been there to watch it, and she would have enjoyed that. I think Como would be her new favourite team.